Bonjour.
Hello. Welcome at the IDRC today. Our speaker today is someone extraordinary.
Our speaker today is an unusual one for us, and for us it's a great privilege to receive her. Why is that? Most of those who speak at IDRC, as you know, are primarily researchers, whereas Dr. Metre is primarily an actor. She does what others research. And it's very useful for us at IDRC to be reminded of how important the action on the ground is. And because she has been tremendously successful in India working on rural development, a subject we have funded a great deal of research on, we thought it would be for us a great education to hear directly from an individual engaged in rural development. Dr. Metre is a medical doctor, and she left a thriving career. She may tell us why, how it came about 25 years ago, and took to the hills, literally, the foothills of the Himalayas, to work on rural development on the ground. She is the director of the Chinmaya Organization for Rural Development, and the acronym is CORD. It's headquartered at Sidbari in the state of Himachal, Pradesh. Those of you who know Himachal Pradesh will know that that is right beneath Dharamsala, where and McLeod-Ganj, where the Dalai Lama has his headquarters. It's a particularly beautiful part of India, but it's also a part of India that was in great need of economic and social development. Dr. Metre was recognized in India by the highest order of award of the country. In 2008, I had the privilege of being at the President's official residence when she received her award. That year, a Canadian also received the same award, Joe Hulse, a former colleague at IDRC. It was a profoundly moving event because in a country of 1.2 billion people, very few are called to this particular order, the Padma Shri. She's also been the Person of the Year for one of India's leading news magazines. She's very well known in the country. I met her in part because one phase of activity at CORD was funded by Canadian CEDA, I think very successfully, judging from the evaluation. And so I was interested in meeting these extraordinary people, doing these extraordinary things. And now that I'm at IDRC, I still feel we have a great deal to learn from what goes on the ground, what the challenges are. The challenges keep changing. And so, Kshama, we're very honored to have you here today. And now we're all ears. Dr. Metre will speak for about 40 minutes. We'll have perhaps 20, 30 minutes of questions, and then we'll repair to an exhibition next door, which aims to be a demonstration of how the self-help approach can actually change lives profoundly. And we thought seeing would be believing, and so it will be something out of the usual in Ottawa to see. Kshama, the microphone's yours.
First of all, I'm very delighted to be in Ottawa today. It's a beautiful weather here. I usually came here when it was chilly. So, Mr. Malone, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of God, I would like to thank you, Mr. Malone, and IDRC for inviting us here. I have Mr. Shivank, Mr. Balbir Guleria with me here. And we have come for the exhibition of Shivank's work, which you have already heard. And for me, it's a great opportunity to talk to you all, scientists, researchers. We are only scientists in the way we are social engineers. Shivank is a member of self-help group in the Kangra district in the state of Himachal Pradesh in northern India. Balbir is a speech therapist with COD and is acting as Shivank's interpreter here. The members of Shivank's self-help group are hearing impaired youth from poor families. God provided them with an opportunity to learn Kangra style of painting. These youths, trained in the Kangra style of miniature painting, formed a self-help group that obtained microcredit under the Sg5 Bank Linkage program to produce greeting cards. You'll be seeing some of them depicting their paintings. This micro enterprise provides them with income. They manage their activities and loans, and COD only acts as a facilitator. The group currently has 8 members, all hearing impaired. Shivank and his group are a fine example of the self-help movement, which I'll be talking to you about. I'm first going to talk about the self-help movement, beginning with the introductory comments, and then discuss its history briefly and current status. For this part of the talk, I have drawn freely from a number of NGO publications and also from the publications of the National Bank of Agriculture and Rural Development and certain reports of the Government of India. The microfinance movement in India is the largest in the world. The scale of the movement is best expressed by quoting 2 lines from the website of NABARD, the apex rural bank that coordinates rural credit and is a key player in the movement. Did you know more than 400 women join this movement every hour? An NGO joins our microfinance program every day. These rates are equivalent to 3.5 million new women joining the SG members every year and 365 new NGOs in the program per year. They were actually exceeded, these figures were exceeded in the last financial year. One of the reasons for the high level of poverty in rural India is low access to credit and financial services. The self-help movement is providing what may be called user-friendly services. In the past, a wide gap existed between the rural masses, the poor masses, and a very large infrastructure of banks in rural India. In 1969, the banks in India were nationalized. One of the main purposes was to make rural credit available to the people. However, the physical presence of the bank did not achieve the desired results. The service of delivery model was not matched to the needs and the abilities of the people. The need of facilitators and alternative system to banking was unmistakably and obviously evident. The self-help movement in India, strictly speaking, is a microfinance movement that succeeded in bringing together the formal financial capital of the banks to the informal social capital of poor people, institutions called the self-help groups, we call them SHGs. It is largely a women's movement. As the majority of SHG members are women, the SHG are groups of up to 20 people who choose to come together to find ways to improve their living conditions. The important features of SHGs are to encourage members to save regularly a small amount, first give intra-group loans from their own resources, operate democratically, and maintain proper accounts and records. It also persuades members to plan for generating additional income. 6 to 12 months after they are formed and have learned credit and saving operations within their own group, with their own resources, the SHGs are considered matured for bank linkage. The SHGs receive loan at the rate of 9% to 11.5% from the banks. The SHGs are free to decide the interest rate that they would charge their members within their little microbank. They require no formal collateral. The movement is thus about the linkage between the self-help groups and banks or microfinance institutions. The SHG concept developed in South India in the mid-1980s from the grassroots by NGOs like Myreda, and was later promoted vigorously by NABARD, the National Bank of Agriculture and Rural Bank, and supported by policy changes required at the national level by the Reserve Bank of India. SHG thus work as a collective guarantee system for members to borrow from organized sources without formal collateral. They have become a very effective way of delivering microfinances to the poor, such as deposits, loans, money transfer, and insurance. The average loan to a SHG today is about 2,000 Canadian dollars, compared with less than $300 in the early 1990s. For the purpose of this presentation, I have converted reports in Indian currency with 1 Canadian dollar equivalent to 46 rupees. India's population is 1.2 billion, as David marked out. Of that number, 37% or 440 million are living below the poverty line. In rural India alone, about 353 million, or a population that is more than 10 times the population of Canada, are below poverty line. These are the people who stand to benefit from the movement. Add to that the urban poor and not so poor. You can imagine how significant and important the self-help movement is. I will now discuss the evolution of the growth of the self-help movement in 3 phases. The pre-1987 lessons learned, the 1987 to 1992 action research periods, and post-1992 SHG bank linkage program. Between 1983 and 1985, several cooperative societies started by an NGO called Myreda in the South broke up because of lack of confidence in the leadership and poor management systems. They broke down into several small groups, and the group members repaid their loans to whichever group they chose to join. Myreda realized that the smaller groups with members with similar backgrounds and gender and trust had a strong feeling of affinity and accountability. Their observation influenced the character of SHGs that were developed in the years ahead. 1987 to 1989 was a period of action research projects, when NABARD offered a grant to Myreda, followed by similar grants to few other NGOs to identify self-help groups, build their capacity, and after a period of months, match their saving with a loan. In 1990, the Reserve Bank of India accepted the SHG strategy as an alternative credit model following an analysis of the research project. This acceptance from the Reserve Bank of India was an important step in the SHG movement. One of RBI's basic functions as a central bank includes monetary and credit regulations. Its role is probably similar to the role of Bank of Canada or the Federal Bank of the US. Whereas NABARD was set up by an Act of Parliament in 1982 as an apex development bank, it provides refinance to lending institutions at 6.5% and coordinates the operations of rural credit institutions and regulates cooperatives and regional rural banks. It is owned by the government and the RBI. Following this action research project, NABARD launched a pilot project of the SG Bank Linkage Program in 1992. It issued guidelines through branches of half a dozen banks for financing 500 SGs. With the help of few NGOs under this 2-year project, NABARD refinanced the banks at 6.5%. The informal thrift and credit SGs came to be recognized as bank clients under this phase. Between 1994 and 1996, RBI constituted a working group to look into issues concerning the SG bank linkage. The group endorsed the operational guidelines issued the banks earlier for the pilot project. Following it in 1996, RBI streamlined the delivery procedures. It allowed the SG to open saving accounts on simple inter-se agreement. It is to the credit, in spite of the modest progress of the working group, who took the view that the linkage model was a cost-effective approach to provide credit from the formal banking system to the unreached rural poor. During 1992 to 1999, the initial years of the movement, progress was slow, and only 33,000 groups could be credit linked during the period. Thereafter, the program grew faster. During 2001 to 2002, the number of SGs financed was 198,000, a 6-fold growth in just 2 years. The Government of India included this SG strategy in the annual plan for 2000-2001. In March 2006, the movement had made even more encouraging progress. Cumulative number of SGs linked was 2.24 million. 33 million families had been assisted. Cumulative bank loans amounted to $2.24 billion. 90% of the groups were women's groups. One can thus see the pace in first 7 years from 1992 to 1999 was slow, with cumulative SCG bank linkage being only 33,000. The very next 7 years, from 1999 to 2006, show a phenomenal growth of SCG bank linkage, the cumulative being 2.24 million. The SCG bank linkage has increased by 68 times in the same period of 7 years. In recent years, the movement has really caught on, and by March 2010, cumulative of SCGs linked with banks reached 6.95 million. About 97 million families have been covered. Cumulative bank loans amounted to $11.7 billion. 80% of the SCGs were exclusive women SCGs. There are 3 well-established models now India follows. One is SCGs being directly nurtured by the banks and then financed by the banks. SCGs promoted by NGOs like us and the government agencies and financed by banks. That's the second model. And the third model, which is really emerging as a very important model, is the one in which the banks finance MFIs, the microfinance institutions, who in turn then give their loans to SCGs or individual borrowers. The self-help group movement includes the SCG formed under the Swaranjanti Gram Swarojgar Yojana. This is a big national program of the government. It is a large-scale program. It provides subsidized credit through banks to only those below the poverty line, and only through SCGs. It aims to generate self-employment through the SCG approach. The program has grown to an enormous size. Of the 6.95 million total SCGs in existence today, 25% of them come from this government program. SCGs have also federated into larger organizations, mainly in South India. Generally, about 15 to 50 SCGs get together to form a cluster village organization. Several clusters of village organizations come together to form an SCG federation. SCG federations are formal groups. Some federations are registered as cooperatives. While the SG bank linkage model achieved reasonable success, it continued to depend on the creation of extensive banking network. The need to scale up linkage led to the introduction in the late 1990s of financial intermediation by microfinance institutions. These MFIs are both commercial and non-commercial nature. They also include MFIs with the Grameen Bank model. The MFI bank linkage model covers financing of MFI by banking agencies for on-lending to the smaller borrowers. The MFI bank linkage model, especially the commercial MFI venture, is becoming increasingly important. In the year ending March 2010, bank loans dispersed under the SG bank linkage and the other MFI bank linkage program were 3.14 billion and 1.75 billion respectively. In the 2 years, the MFI linkage disbursement share of total disbursement for the two models has doubled from 18% to 36%. I will conclude the first part of my talk with the observation that the self-help movement has made good progress in recent years, but its quantitative impact on reducing poverty is not clear, as there is no recent impact study. One study conducted in 2000 showed 18% increase in employment rate and reduction in the percentage of households below the poverty line from 42% to 22% of the households studied. This sample study was very small. It was from the experience of 560 members of 223 SG in 11 states of India. That is rather a small sample for the large movement which has reached 100 million people today. So we still have to really look at the impact it has created. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I will switch over to CORD's experience in the movement and share those with you in an anecdotal manner. First, I will talk about CORD's groups before they got involved with the microfinance in 1994. I will call them women's groups in this talk. Then I will discuss our experience with the movement till 1999, when we became a resource center for NABARD, and then talk about our post-1999 experiences. Finally, I will share some conclusions derived from our continuing association with this movement. Before 1994, since the mid-1980s, CORD has been forming women's groups of 20 to 60 poor women in the villages to bring them together on a common platform to holistically address the multiple negative factors in their lives. CORD is building their capacity through their active participation in decision-making, taking into consideration local wisdom and insights, besides other factors to find relevant and realistic solutions to their problems. Individually, poor people cannot overcome powerlessness. Collectively, they can. Hence, these groups, though not called self-help groups then, were being facilitated by CORD to find solutions to the problems that affected them and their communities. They paid 2 to 10 rupees, or say 4 to 20 cents per month as membership fee to their group. Their money was used by the group for any purpose that they considered worthwhile. It could be spent for helping out an individual or be spent on some community activity. The common interests of these groups were social justice, gender discrimination, health, sanitation, linking natural resources management such as water supply with their livelihood, and increasingly voicing their political issues through the panchayat system of local governance, and networking with the government to make sure that the government schemes reach the poorest of the poor. In 1994, NABARD approached us to participate in the SG bank linkage scheme in Himachal Pradesh, one of the northernmost states in India. Although by that time, CORD had formed and nurtured around 130 women's groups in 130 villages, CORD had not yet joined the microcredit movement that has started in South India. The many banks and their branches in northern India were not yet open to the idea of lending to the poor. They did not at all consider them creditworthy. The movement had therefore not reached us. NABARD was aware that banks in northernmost states in India had not been sensitized to lending to the poor and asked CORD to become the financial intermediary. NABARD would lend to CORD at 6.5% interest rate, and CORD in turn would lend to the women's group. My response was to say that we are not in the banking business, lacked the know-how, and that I personally was a pediatrician and very basic knowledge of the financial sector. I suggested that they should let the large number of rural banks in the area lend money to the poor women directly, a role that they were not playing. We then requested NABARD to help us develop a system to link the poor directly to the banks, and they responded very positively. CORD soon began to add on microfinance activities on the women's groups who were already in the process of developing their organizational and management systems. CORD began by building up to 2 to 4 self-help groups in each of the already existing women's groups and nurtured them with NABARD's help and support. It was a challenge to devise a simple accounting system. We did not want to even try the formal double-entry bookkeeping system of accounts, as it would be beyond the abilities of the simple semi-literate and illiterate village women. Also, we were dealing with very small sums of money, and costs has to be negligible. With excellent support from NABARD's regional management and staff, we had to work with the groups to develop an easy and simple method to record keeping that would work for the group and that could also provide all the information that a financial system would require. A system had to be developed for accounts for saving, internal group lending, and record keeping with rules and regulations that were relevant and meaningful to the groups was designed with women's participation. After the SAG were formed, the members were saving a very small amount, less than $0.50 per month. They were pooling their savings and loaning the money internally to needy members and charging an interest of ₹2 per 100 rupees per month. Initially, the husbands of the SAG members were suspicious of the system. They would often comment that the interest rate charged was too high. We had to explain to them that the SAG was lending the money to its own members and that each of the members, including the borrower, was a shareholder in the interest that the borrower paid to the group and that their capital would grow. We said it was their own little microgram with which they were lending internally to members who were also owners and that the interest was being added to their kitty. It was some time before the women fully understood the process and began enjoying this add-on activity. 6 months to a year after the SAG's formation, the village women, having learned to manage their own finances, were considered mature now for credit linkage with the bank to access credit, which is usually 2 to 4 times their own savings and interest earned from internal loaning. Later on, after credit linkage with the bank had been established and the SAG had taken out a larger loan from the banks at an interest rate of 9% to 11.5% for on lending to members, while making installment payments to the bank, the significance of the margin realized and its impact on their capital really hit the women, members of the SAG, and they were very happy. At this point, I would like to relate how the women's reaction to interest rate change at a much later stage. As these groups matured further and went on to the second and third bank linkage with larger loans, we noticed to our delight that they had realized on their own that whilst the earlier interest of 2% per month charged by the SAG to the members on the smaller loans did not pinch their pockets, now that they were growing and taking much larger loans of 5 to 25,000 rupees each, this kind of interest definitely was too much cash outflow for them. So they brought down the interest rate for the SAG's lending to its members from 24% per year to 12% per year as they advanced in their loan portfolio. Cash in hand was empowering. However, many of the poorest of the poor women would not join the group as they felt they could not save even less than $0.50 per month. However, the other women encouraged them. The women in the village were already bonded together because of the women's group found by us earlier. They would help by suggesting alternative methods of saving. Some of them, who were a little bit better off, would invite such poor women to help them out with some labor work in their rather small farms or at their home and ask them to save what they earn for depositing within the SGs. The strength of the group lies in the flexibility.
Le groupe gagne sa force dans sa souplesse. Les femmes prennent les décisions relatives aux déboursés et à l'objet.
Each of these women takes loans for what they consider their priority. Usually the initial loans are what many bankers call consumer loans and are often quite wary of them and sometimes insist without understanding the reality that the women only take out productive loans much later. Nevertheless, NGOs like us who are able to see the realities from very close quarters consider the so-called consumer loans to be essential investments of poor families. These include medicine, clothes, food, education of their children, repairing homes, purchasing important accessories for the kitchen, and certain small social obligations and functions, wedding, birth and death, and other rituals. We were often struck by the little things that made a difference in the initial phase of this group development. At this juncture, I'm reminded of a woman telling us with delight that at last she had a tea strainer at home for which she had been begging her husband for the past 15 years. He used to rebuke her and remark with disdain, "Why can't you use a piece of old cloth to strain the tea leaves?" whenever she would plead with him for it. Seeing the success of these groups created demand in the surrounding villages. This add-on activity of microfinance for the women's group through their smaller self-help groups began to spread like wildfire in CORD's operational area with successful bank linkages and 100% repayments. And by 1999, a total of 555 such groups had been formed. NABARD realized that it was time to scale up the process in other districts of Himachal Pradesh, as well as 3 other northernmost states of India where the movement had not yet started. It is interesting to note that it was around the same time in 1999 that the Government of India launched the special scheme combining of all anti-poverty programs to the Sgs5 program. To promote this scheme, a large number of government employees were assigned to work together with the banks and NGOs to reach those below the poverty line. The important feature of the scheme was a matching government subsidy. An SAG borrowing under this scheme would get a loan from the bank together with the subsidy which the bank disbursed on behalf of the government. The subsidy from the government equaled the loan amount for up to a maximum of 27,000 Canadian dollars. In 1999, CORD was nominated by NABARD as a resource center to sensitize, orient, and train bankers, NGO members, government employees, and grassroots women beneficiaries in 4 northernmost states of India, namely Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Jammu and Kashmir. NABARD adopted the training manual developed by CORD through its learning and participatory design with the village women. NABARD was aware that without sensitizing the bankers in northern India, it would be impossible to facilitate the movement in this region. Hence, the very first batch of trainees sent to CORD as a resource was very senior bankers of the region. NABARD asked even chairmen and senior-most executives of all banks in northern states to visit and attend the sensitization program at CORD Training Center. I think it was with great reluctance that these officers traveled 12 hours through difficult roads to our center at the foothills of the Himalayas, as no other mode of transport was then accessible. Their experience in lending to the very poor individuals in the village so far had been a great failure. They were concerned whether a system for lending to unregistered groups would really work to add fuel to the fire. When they arrived in Sidbadi, where CORD is located, they realized that the arrangement for their living at the ashram, it's akin to a monastery, with which we were associated, was simple and austere, and that it included washing their own plates after the meals. Next morning, when they arrived for training at the center, they looked around, very grim and uncomfortable. Their precious time was being wasted in a remote village. We informed the bankers that the real trainees are the village women in different villages that they would be visiting. All they needed to do when they visited the village was to sit down with the village women and exchange the usual cursory conversations with them. The women will share on their own the activities in their SHGs and the way they run their groups, save, lend, and access microcredit from the bank, maintain records and minutes of the meeting. They were not quite convinced, as the impression of the village women was that of shy, poor, illiterate, semi-literate, withdrawn women with their faces covered under a veil, unable to interact with strangers. When the bankers returned in the evening, after the visit to the villages, they were completely transformed. Very excited and happy. They remarked that one had to see to believe how efficiently simple village women can successfully manage their little microbank independently. They were even more surprised when they discovered that the repayment rate was 100% within the groups, as well as between the SHG and the banks that had dispersed loans to them with minimal transaction cost. To the bank, they were now convinced that the linkage was a good mechanism to provide banking facilities to the unreached poor. It was a win-win situation for both the banks and the poor villages. The poor women would get loans for whatever purpose they desired, and the banks in the rural area would be able to increase their outreach to an optimal level. The bankers had also observed the confidence, the light in the eyes of the rural women when they spoke freely and confidently to them. In addition, they had observed with delight how simple village women were taking initiatives to resolve many other issues of concern to them. It was clear to the bankers that along with the capacity to manage microfinance, they had developed leadership qualities in many other spheres. Each one of the senior bankers asked us when they could send their bank managers from different states to be trained by CORD through NABARD. They had also understood the movement's role as the catalyst for empowering the poor, especially the women. The same story was repeated with the government officials and representatives of other NGOs. Seeing is believing. By now, with NABARD's active support, CORD has trained over 32,000 functionaries and beneficiaries to spread the movement in these 4 northernmost states of India to promote the SHG bank linkage model. CORD now, in its operation area, has a background of promoting over 1,700 active SHGs with over 30,000 members that also provide the experiential training background for training more workers in the field. SHGs promoted by CORD have saved $1.4 million and have dispersed $5.4 million in loans. I would like to illustrate a few stories of the self-help movement to highlight how it touches the lives of the poorest of the poor and how they mutually help one another. The first is about Binta Devi. She became a widow in 2006 when her truck driver husband died of HIV/AIDS. She was ostracized along with her 2 children by her family and community. Was kicked out of her original room in the household by her in-laws and put into a very small dark room with water leakage from the roof. Physically and verbally abused by her in-laws, who too are extremely poor. And her children were forced to drop out of school. Without a penny to her name, she and her children became malnourished and emaciated. When we saw her, she weighed only 34 kilos. The women's groups and the SHG in the villages became concerned about Binta. She and her 2 children were referred by the group for HIV testing. Thankfully, all tests were negative. With the facilitation of her group, the field workers helped her to get some food from the government public distribution system. The family was counseled about HIV/AIDS, and her rightful place in the home was ensured. Children who had been thrown out by the small village school went back to school. Furthermore, the group ensured that Binta became entitled to the widow's pension of $7 per month from the government, which, though very small, means much to her. Her group motivated her to learn sewing skills. She joined CORD sewing training program where she could earn as she learned. As she learned an item, then she could stitch well. She began to take small loans from her SHG, buy raw material to make stitch projects. She began to earn a small amount every month. By 2009, she began to get enough orders to earn fair living from this micro-enterprise. She now trains few other girls in stitching, charging them a small fees, and adds additional money to her savings. Presently, she is an important micro-entrepreneur and member of Gurudhara SHG. To us, what she earns is very important. To you, it will be astonishing. Today, she earns approximately $100 per month and weighs 42 kg. From zero income to this level is a great achievement for us and her. It allows her to live simply with her 2 children. Vinta says, when my husband was alive, I had no tension whatsoever. The first year after his death was very hard for me. But now, since I've started earning, my dream is to have a home and educate my 2 sons. There are thousands of Vintas. However, there are no uniform situations and thus no uniform solutions. Yet when given the opportunity and support by groups, they demonstrate their guts, fortitude, and become self-reliant. Very often, working with women's group, we learn what works for them. In the initial stages of our program, around 40 to 80% of the women in the SHG use thumb impressions to sign their attendance and transactions. It was very difficult to change the attitude of women to start learning to read and write. At least read and write their own names. They questioned us, what will we earn by learning to read and write? Our persuasion brought about some change, but not to the degree that we desired. However, we learned the trick soon enough. One day, when an attempt to persuade women in the tribal village to learn to at least sign their names was unsuccessful, one of the older women said to other women, if you still use your thumb impression and not learn to sign your name, when you die, you will not know if someone puts your thumb impression on the document of concern to you. The risks impressed the women and they began to learn to read and write. The most exciting time was when they could dial numbers on a mobile phone and reach a government officer to demand facilities for their village that were still pending after repeated assurances. These stories are just to give you certain glimpses of what the self-help movement entails. Besides Himachal Pradesh, God is also working in Tamil Nadu, Orissa. In the tribal areas of Orissa, there are villages with more than 60 to 70% below poverty line. The rise of SHG is bringing about certain changes with women in SHGs, taking to tenant farming. Many of them are taking loans to install tube wells to overcome shortage of water, as well as mobilizing and utilizing the government subsidies that are available to them. Now, in conclusion, the movement has grown fast during the recent year and has helped empower women both politically and socio-economically. The reasons for the growth of the movement in general and the SHG banking particularly are many. The main reasons are NABARD's policy guidance and capacity building role and RBI's support. Innovations and pioneering work of local, national and international NGOs and developmental agencies. Support from many departments and agencies of central and state governments and funding agencies, corporates and individuals interested in empowering the poor. Now I would like to talk about the challenges that this movement faces. They include uneven growth across the country. Many of the poorest states in central and northeast India are lagging far behind the rest of the country. In contrast, the successful states, mostly in the south, have many stakeholders, including the aggressive commercial microfinance institutions engaged in the movement. These MFIs have been a significant contributor to the movement, but in recent years, we have noted that some of the MFIs are too aggressive and lend without making much effort to understand the capacity of the borrowers to absorb the loans. They also do not build capacity in new areas. There are a lot of conflicting policy environment too. That's another challenge. The third challenge is often the poorest of the poor have been left out of the movement for various reasons. A greater and focused effort needs to be made to include the poorest of the poor to ensure their participation in the movement. Low quality of SHGs, when due attention is not given to developing their skills. Severe shortage of quality human resources. Most of the qualified people are unwilling to serve remote, poor, backward regions of the country. We have to work much harder to inspire foot soldiers and foot commanders to serve those areas of rural India where the need is most. persisting negative attitudes of some bankers in remote areas that lending to the poor is bound to be a failure, and the complete disregard or interest in linking the poor groups for financial services. Inadequate loan size for enterprising groups. A long time ago, in the initial years of work, I faced this dilemma. Some of our groups and their members were evolving and moving fast and becoming quite enterprising. They had already been linked with the banks for loan and had repaid the banks. At this juncture, I called up one of the senior managers of NABARD and said, "You have taught us and our groups banking, and when the SHGs are growing well, why are the banks now refusing them adequate loans?" He responded by saying, "Why don't you call and ask the bank's senior managers? Don't you give the Tatas and the Birlas, they're big companies in India, large loans based on good track record? Why don't you now give these groups the loan they want to conduct their micro enterprise on the basis of their good track record?" They got their loans. However, this is not the norm. We need to listen to this micro voices at the macro level. Thank you all for giving me a patient hearing. I have enjoyed sharing with you this very important self-help movement in India. Like many others, this movement is very close to my heart, particularly because it enables the poor in our country to realize their hidden potential. We have a long way to go, but I'm optimistic that something good is happening out there. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the people of Canada for the funding support that CORD has received from Canadian International Development Agency and our partner, Chinmaya Mission of Halton region, for many years. Without that help, we would not be where we are today. Namaste. Thank you.
Well, Kshama, thank you very much. I'd simply add myself before we open the floor, and there are two microphones in the middle aisles, and I'd ask you to go to them and identify yourselves in order to engage Dr. Metre, that when Helen Economo, who's with us today, I think somewhere,
yes,
and I first visited CORD in Sidbari in 2007, I think it was, what struck me was the diversity of activities. The presentation focused mostly on funding, and funding is critical. Without funding, nothing much happens. But what struck me at the time was the number of different groups brought together by this particular self-help organization around interests of concern, for example, mothers of severely handicapped children, women wishing to learn a profession, young people who were hearing impaired and who were painting, all sorts of different groups that otherwise would never have been drawn together were drawn together by this institution and empowered by it. So while the financing aspect is extremely important, the organizational power of a self-help group, particularly a well-organized one, is very important also, and fundamentally changes lives, as you'll see with Shivank's work. You can see Balbir's interpreting for Shivank over there when we go to the exhibition next door, because without this organization, he never would have learned the skill of painting. As a disabled youth, he would have been thought perhaps unworthy of training in a particular skill, and today he holds 3 jobs and makes a very healthy living as a result of developing self-confidence as well as professional capacity. So I simply wanted to add that, Kshama, to what you had to say.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
So others, please. Microphone in each of the aisles. Sir, please. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, that would help us.
Thank you very much. David Welsh, University of Ottawa. No, I liked it very much, your talk, and I thought it's an empowering to listen to that because of all the negative things we often hear coming out of India and other parts of the world. One thing you said, but you said it very quickly, and I was wondering if you could elaborate. You said one of the reasons why it was a success, we're talking once again the financial aspect, and it's interesting now that we have the other aspects, was because there was your women's group already there. And therefore, it enabled it as a women's group to be a catalyst to join up when this capital was coming.
It was for the beginning of our program because we already had those groups.
Yeah.
But most areas that we train, in the other states, they have no groups. And even now when we expanded our program, we don't have any groups. But if you have a good system of training them, it works, whatever it may be. But the system of training and empowering them must be very clear. Sometimes when we don't train them and do not empower them to run their own banks, then we actually disempower them.
Okay. So it helps if there's a group there, but the fact you go into areas with your group to do the training, that's the key thing to the process of empowerment. So you don't always have to have groups already there.
No. In our case, it was just the history that I had to tell you.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Others, please. Sir.
Dr. Metre, I'm Teddy Tanny from the Pearson Peacekeeping Center. What advice or what insight would you share with field workers who have to work through a patriarchal system to allow women to have access to even simple things like basic health care?
Yes. See, the patriarchal system is there for very long, and it's difficult to overcome them in one generation. However, when women start earning, they change their own self-image. When the image changes, they bring about changes in this type of a system, which is very patriarchal. The empowerment of women is bringing about that change, and we are seeing it all over. It is sad that one area we haven't yet overcome, because that is too deep down in the Indian psyche. Preference for a male child. There we are still suffering, and that's what makes us sometimes think that we have not really empowered. We've done a lot of empowerment, but if the sex ratio below 6 years still keeps falling, we have a lot to work, a lot to do.
Please.
Dr. Metre, it's very inspiring presentation that you have. I would like to ask, you gave examples of women, they lend money but not for productive purposes.
In the beginning.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering how they repay back the loan, first of all, and then of the statistic that you mentioned, I don't recall that if there is any statistic for what percentage of non-repayment or because that's always the
very good
problem.
question. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, see what happens that when they are in the beginning of this self-help movement, amount of money is very small. You know what the loan is about? 100 rupees. 500 rupees. $2. It's very small. But their needs at that time are so essential, it's stupid of us to ask for a productivity thing. But as they grow in the self-help movement and they have exhausted their very important needs, by the time that we are working with them on a lot of income generation schemes, they're able to pay back. But that small loans are very small, so they do extra work somewhere else and then earn that amount and come back. For those small loans. But later on, it's essential to move them on into income generation. But
generally they can pay back.
Yeah, that's 40% of most of our analysis is non-productive. Okay, but it's all right because, see, this is so small that they can pay back. And sometimes it's very essential, like building a toilet in their homes. So those are essential needs, and we allow that. And meanwhile, they do some job. During the harvesting season, most of the payment comes back.
I think, if I may add a word, often microcredit is seen by Canadians like us as equivalent to banking. But actually, in its early phases, it's much more like social investment than it is like banking. It becomes like banking as people's incomes grow. But the initial investments that allow people to become productive often are not profitable investments. It's what follows that's profitable.
And sorry, my second question is if there is percentage. Oh, sorry. I'm curious about percentage of unpaid loan. Yes, thanks.
In the beginning, because the movement had not many players, it was 100%. Okay? As we are growing into a large movement, the government also being involved in a very big way. 25% of those loans are going through the government services where there's a big target and the amount is very large. The default rate has come up in certain areas, come down, I mean, to as low as 75% to 80%. In certain areas and pockets, you will see the certain defaults. But generally, even today, it's for the whole population is around 85%.
Repayment. Good. Please, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Dima Saab. I'm a summer student here at the center. I was wondering if you encountered any resistance from the men in the communities.
Oh, yes.
And how you dealt with that, and even at the household level and even at the community level as well.
Okay. In the beginning, the men would laugh at the women and say they've gone crazy, they're wasting their time, they could come home and do some of the work that they need to do. So what we started doing was asking men to join and observe our group work. As their understanding grew, and we always told the women in the groups, you must share what is happening here with your menfolk. Go back home, during dinner, you talk about it. That helped. But there was only one group which we didn't allow to be told much because they would snatch the money out of the women. Those were the alcoholics. Alcoholics were not told much. It was very difficult to get them out. But as the women started earning money, there was a lot of change in the relationship between men and women.
Please.
Hello, my name is Maria Isabel Bayer, and I'm a summer student here, and also I attend the University of Ottawa. And I recently did research on the Grameen Bank, and I just want to clarify if these loans are for individuals or is it collective loans in a community, because I saw reports of the bankers would kind of put they kind of create a police state or a police community where the women would gang up on other women that weren't repaying the loans and so on. Have you seen that
Yes.
in your community? And then the also point was when it comes to the patriarchal society, have you seen when the men decide to take the loan for themselves, how do the women usually try to repay back? And also in other places in Africa, when they're starting to earn profit on their own, they'll spend the money on various objects in the market before coming home, so the husbands wouldn't take their profits. So have you experienced
Yes.
situations like that?
Okay. See, there are two modes of giving loans. If you use the self-help group to give loan to the self-help group, it never fails, because there's a social pressure within the group, and that pressure to the women is very important. Most of our pattern in India is through self-help groups. But now with the microfinance institutions, we have many types of models too. Some of the microfinance institutions are giving loans directly to the individuals. They have a very coercive way of getting back their loans amount. So that's how they're managing. Otherwise, individuals, we wouldn't dare do it because it's sure to fail. And your second question about men taking the money. See, as I said in the beginning, it took some men some time to understand. But when it started getting income to the family, when women earns, the income goes to the family. And they're very happy about it. Now women are buying a lot of things for the men folk because they can get loan. Like buying a taxi, getting their petty shops stored. So they're working together. We don't have that problem because we make the women take the loan and the responsibility, and we call the men for the larger loans. So we have a counseling session, and when you have a counseling session, it works.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Hi, my name is Florence Brake. And first of all, I want to thank you for the wonderful presentation that you've done. I am presently a volunteer, and I provide basic financial literacy training. Mm-hmm. And my target are immigrants. Mm-hmm. And in their countries, they were not the poorest. Yes. But majority of them, once they come here, they are the poorest. Okay. Now, the question I have is whether you have encountered the poor in the urban areas and how you have handled their cases. Okay. And the difference here will be that in Canada, maybe most of the North America, microcredit is not something very known. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to start one, but everywhere I talked about it, I was asked which country in the South I was going to take it to. So I just want to find out what your experiences are.
It's a very good question, Florence. Because when you go out for microcredit in urban areas, it's very different from rural areas. In rural areas, their homes belong there. They're going to be there all the time. They have a stake in staying there and living there. Whereas in urban areas, it's different. They're migrating. You form a group, and someone might leave the group without making the payment. So the pattern for urban area and the assurances that you have to take are much more. Mm-hmm. We start in those slum areas where the slum areas are almost not migratory. You learn from them first. Mm-hmm. You have to ensure that the group meets every time, that the members do not run away from that area. Once you have worked with them, you will get the local insights that, all tricks. We learn tricks from the people. Actually, the movement, even the rules and regulations that we have formed is not our own. From learning from the people, we understand what should be the rules and regulations for them. And then we impose them with their discussion. They have to pass the rules. It's not ours, but they have to pass each rule and say yes to it. For example, if you come late for the meeting, do you want to fine your members because they'll waste your time? What will be the fine? That way. If a person doesn't come for a meeting, unless she has a very important reason not to be there, how much fine will she pay next month? Okay? Okay. And for migratory populations or populations that are slum areas, it is best to start with small loans. Once they have trust with each other, then there's no worry. It's the beginning that may be a little difficult.
Thank you very much. And we'll take one last intervention or question, please, ma'am.
Namaste. My name is Nutan. I'm at the University of Ottawa. I'm doing my master's degree there. I have two tiny questions. I don't know if you've got time for both. Just following up on the question about the urban microcredit. When I've spent time in India, a lot of my friends and family, they participate in committees, which I don't think is at all the same thing as microcredit and is very unregulated and very high risk. And I was wondering if microcredit has made any inroads in dissolving some of these committees, which are extremely high risk and, like I said, unregulated.
See, self-help by itself is very powerful. This is what I talked to you about is a microcredit self-help. But remember the Alcoholic Anonymous movement. It's a self-help movement. It has cured many alcoholics. Similarly, when you start working with a group and you make sure that they trust each other, and then you help them to increase that trust levels, it does happen, because there are now a number of urban microcredit groups. And your question about whether it resolves issues?
Or dissolves the committees, these neighborhood committees that are doing something similar but with much higher risk and a lot more money at stake, I think.
See, in the beginning, they're money lenders. They would not want them to take their own loans. But now the studies, after many years, almost 25 years, now we are seeing the money lenders have brought down their interest rate. Mm-hmm. So it has changed them. The communities that were actually misusing their powers in the beginning have now fallen in line.
That's great. My second tiny question was, you were mentioning in the beginning that some of these SHGs are making better linkages with the panchayats as well, and I wanted to know, has there been an impact in not just financial empowerment,
tremendous.
But social?
It's like a revolution. See, the fact that the women who never got out of their homes now get out of their homes, network with departments of various government departments, have begun to speak to men. Their participation in local self-governance is much more than men, especially if you are in the beginning facilitating the process and then leave it. In many areas, see, now we have reserved seats for local self-governance for women. Earlier there weren't. But now women are winning their own reserved seats, 50%, and the open seats of the men. They're beating them hollow in some of the cases, because of the fact that these self-help groups have a great affinity and they have helped many people. It's not only about microcredit, it's about working together, solving solutions, someone's wedding, someone's death, everyone is together. So it gives them a lot of voting power, and it changes. It is changing pretty fast in certain areas. Certain other areas are like very remote areas, like Mr. David was talking to me about. In Orissa, it's a little difficult because that literacy rate is very low. Mm-hmm. So it will take a lot of effort there to change, but areas that have better literacy rates, their changes are occurring.
Great. Thank you.
One reason a bit earlier today that Dr. Metre was saying that microcredit, self-help, all the rest of what we've been discussing is important in rural areas of India is that in spite of the poverty of these areas, the quality of life is actually higher than it is in slums in the urban areas. So the more people who can be naturally attracted to stay in rural areas and develop productive livelihoods in rural areas, their quality of life will be better.
Definitely.
So the lure of the cities is more money, but with the money you lose quality of life. Rural areas in India, depending on the state, still offer significant quality of life, and so that's another angle of this very complex question. How fast can urbanization go without producing a train wreck? So there are many angles to this particular set of issues that Dr. Metre has presented to us today. We're deeply indebted to you, Kshama. Thank you so much. Through the video, many others will capture what you were able to share with us today. And now I invite you all to go and see next door what Shivank and his 7 or 8 colleagues in his particular small self-help group produce and what has revolutionized their lives in India. Thank you very much.